So here we are in Deuteronomy. Moses is preparing to send the Israelites into the promised land without him. And he just is wondering what kind of things do they need to know? What wisdom do they need to take with them in order to succeed in this new land? And a theme comes up. Remember and don't forget. This is a major theme in Deuteronomy. And that's sort of what we engaged in last Sunday, was remembering the origins of Wellspring. And I wanted to just start by saying a heartfelt thank you for all of the wonderful sharing and remembering that happened last week. It is such a blessing and a gift to my family as we merge into this community. I understand that you've probably been doing a lot of remembering lately with retirements and preparing to call your new pastor. And now with the transition, I'm sure that that might be getting fatiguing a little bit. We might have a little bit of remembering fatigue. But on Sunday when I went home, I just wanted to share that on Sunday when I went home and I was talking with John, I realized that as I've been engaging in this process, I've learned a lot about Wellspring. I've been hearing all kinds of stories in my interviews and during the transition process and with all of my walking with Wendy's where I've been hearing all kinds of wonderful stories. But I've realized that John and the girls haven't heard most of these stories. And so sharing these things really invited them in, and I really, really appreciate that. That is a gift and a blessing. So I hope if you're getting a little tired of remembering, that you'll think of it as, this is a gift. But it's important, I think, also as we move forward and we begin to vision for what the future is going to look like for Wellspring, that we not forget where we have been and how we've arrived here. In Deuteronomy, along with remembering, another big theme that kind of goes hand in hand with this is about teaching this to the next generation, to passing on what they have learned. Remembering is not just for the sake of reminiscing. It teaches those who have not been along for the whole journey how they've arrived and the important pieces that have shaped the identity of the community. Remember, don't forget, and teach the next generation. So when I was thinking about this remembering series for September, I'm not sure why it didn't occur to me that September 11th would be during this month. I mean, it is every year. But I hadn't put those two things together until this week. And what an interesting intersection with remembering and not forgetting. As I was working on my thoughts for the message this Wednesday, my Facebook feed was just full of like post after post after post saying, never forget, remember. And so that just added another layer to this concept. Edie came home from school on Wednesday with homework to ask the adults in her life what they remembered about September 11th. And so she asked me, what do you remember? And I walked her through my memory of this day and the days that followed. Where were you when it happened? Did you wait in a long line of cars to put gas in your car? Were you scared? What do you remember? September 11th, 2001 is a pivotal day in our history. It's one of those days where there's a definite before and after. It affects the way that we think about nearly everything in some big ways and also subtle ways. So as my news feed was just full of all these posts and memes and articles encouraging me to remember and never forget this day and the lessons that it has taught us, the emotion and the action that it inspires in us, I realized that remembering is an act of meaning making. It's about more than just recounting the facts of how something happened. And so as I scrolled through my news feed, many of the posts were pleading with me to remember the kind of people that we were on September 12th. The day when the absolute worst brought out the absolute best in so many people. When what unified us became more important than the things that divided us. People giving of themselves in sacrificial ways, literally blood, sweat, and tears. Blood banks across the country collecting so much blood, more than they could even use. People volunteering to help in a multitude of ways. And a nation crying together, sharing and sitting in the pain with all of those who had lost so much. Because in many different ways, we all lost so much on that day. We lost our sense of security. So on September 12th, 2001, and then the later half of that month, is a time that I remember feeling this sense of solidarity that I had never experienced before, and that sadly we have gotten so far away from. People were compelled to reach out to their neighbor in whatever way that they could think of. What do we do with a heart full of empathy and a desire to reach out in love? I remembered this week how in the tiny town of Fonda, Iowa, part of the school system, Newell Fonda, that I grew up in, Betty Nielsen, a mother of one of the girls I went to high school with, started making quilts out of her heart full of empathy. It started out, she was going to make 5 quilts in honor of the victims. And she gathered people in the community, and pretty quickly, they created 5 quilts. But then her vision expanded. She wanted to make a quilt for every victim. And this vision took on a life of its own. She started a nonprofit called Freedom Quilts, and she formed a network of quilters all across the country, and people all across the country were making handmade quilts that they then sent to Betty, and Betty and her husband drove around the country hand delivering these quilts to the families of victims. I hadn't thought about that story in a long time, and so I looked it up. And on their website, there's a long list of the people who they've honored with a quilt. And their website says, through the gift of a quilt, we strive to comfort these families and preserve the honor and memory of their loved ones. Quilts as gifts of love and compassion. This is just one tiny little story from a tiny little town in northwest Iowa in a sea of many, many stories that we want to remember and not to forget. A story that shows us at our best. When our thoughts were beyond ourselves, our hearts went out to others, and then our actions followed. As I was remembering and reading all of these posts about remembering and not forgetting, though, I noticed that there was something missing from the memories. Something that is also a part of a September 12th American experience. None of the posts that I read remembered how, out of fear and ignorance, this was an awful time to be a Muslim in this country. Our Muslim neighbors were targets of suspicion and threats and intimidation and violence. It was a very scary time to look a little different from the majority of people in your community, to dress differently or to worship differently. So then I Googled a story trying to look for a story of this discrimination and this violence against Muslims in the aftermath of September 11th, 2001. And sadly, the very first thing that popped up was a current story about a pastor of a Baptist church in Michigan who had called himself a proud Islamophobe. And he had decided he was going to remember September 11th this year by hosting an anti-Muslim service featuring topics that included how the interfaith movement is sabotaging America and the church, and how Islam is destroying America from within. I mean, fortunately, this didn't get a very good response, and so this event was canceled before it happened. But I believe that this is evidence that we need to remember and not forget the whole of the story. This week, as I was pondering how we remember and how we want to remember the best of who we can be, because we want to teach our children and we want to pass on our best and highest values. But I realized that in order to really glean the wisdom from these memories, we must hold intention where our lived experience doesn't actually live up to those highest values to which we aspire. And I really appreciate how last week we did some of this. We held in tension those stories of joy and blessing about the beginnings of Wellspring, and also the stories of the sadness and the loss and the pain that are just woven into that story as well. So it was a crazy day to be contemplating the intentional act of remembering. This week just made it seem different somehow. In our passage from Deuteronomy today, Moses tells the Israelites to pay attention to the regulations and the case laws and the commandments that God had given them. And that they were to keep these so that everyone will know how wise and how wonderful they are. People will say, surely this great nation is full of wise and insightful people. When I read this passage in Deuteronomy, I have to admit that I kind of laughed. It struck me as interesting because I can tell you that's never like the first impression that I ever have when I am reading these laws in Deuteronomy. I don't sit there and think, wow, these are a people that are so great and so special because their laws are so just. I must say that my first thought when I read Deuteronomy, this really stood out to me. It really had me thinking about the way that the Torah may have been viewed within its context. From a Christian perspective, we're often so skewed to place law against grace as though they're in opposition. But for the Israelites, this law was grace. This was a gift from the God who had claimed them. When we often encounter things in the Hebrew Bible from our context, we think of this as a story of a harsh God whose wrath we should fear. And though we have no way of knowing how this impression might have impacted the people that were around them, we don't know what the impression their laws made on people. Several principles that are in the Torah are unique among ancient Near East laws, including the treatment of aliens and bondservants, the prohibition of collective and vicarious punishment, and the absence of capital punishment for economic crimes. So the Israelites are a people who are bound by these laws that spell out ways that they are to handle disputes, ways that tried to provide a little equity between rich and poor, and between insider and outsider. And some of these things seem really shocking to us, but they may have been shocking and revolutionary in their own context. They actually were a progressive step forward. So anyway, thinking about laws and what the laws tell us about these people, and then this had me thinking about our bylaws and what they say about our community, what we hold sacred, what is important for us to remember and to teach and to pass on. If you haven't looked at our bylaws for a while, or maybe ever, I included them in the notes in the Bible app. I just included Article 1 and Article 2. There are some other parts of this document also that include things about how we govern ourselves and the job descriptions of all the people, but I just put in there Article 1 and Article 2. Article 1 is about our name. I just want to put a little pin in this for our discussion point. I'm really curious about how Wellspring got her name. And so I'm hoping that that's something that you will share when we get to our sharing time. I'm curious. But Article 2 really is the meat of the document. It's the purpose of Wellspring. And I think that this is the article that we want to teach and to remember. This is the kind of stuff that will help people see the kind of people we are and what we stand for. It says that we want to enunciate the gospel's healing message of acceptance. And what an important message that is. This is one of the things that drew me to Wellspring. We understand that salvation through Jesus Christ means being made sound or whole, and this is intended for individuals, communities, and all of humanity. We intend to extend invitation to the community into a diverse and inclusive gathering to celebrate spirituality and re-envision possibilities and hope for redemption for, once again, for individuals, for the community, and for the world in which we live. This is a church without walls, which is a really important thing that we talked about last week when we talked about origins. Human and financial resources will be directed into the community and not into acquiring and maintaining property. This is an important value, and this is another one of those things that drew me to Wellspring. So these bylaws are things that say important things about who we are and who we have agreed to be in community. And I think if we put them in conversation with our passage from Deuteronomy this week, it made me wonder what our bylaws communicate about our community to the community beyond our church. Perhaps people might say, surely this is a great church full of wise and insightful people. It says who we are. And these values are what's important to teach and pass on to our next generation. We don't want to forget our purpose. These are our ideals, our best way of being in the world when we are at our best. And so I invite you to remember with me our identity, who we are. Remember it in whatever way strikes you today. But the importance of remembering is twofold. It reminds us, it reconnects us to our values so that we can then also teach the next generation of those who have not been along on the journey with the rest of us. It's a way of inviting everyone to identify with our identity. Reading bylaws is pretty boring. But they say so much about the principles that we hold dear. But it helps us to realize that we can talk about what it is that we value, but it's the way that we put those values into action that really speaks about who we are in the world. And that's what we're trying to do right now, is remembering and reconnecting so that we can be the kind of people that are at our best in the world. And this is also an amazing jumping off point. As we remember these things, this is a great place for us to start as we vision for what is to come next for the community. And so now I invite you to remember with me who we are